What began as dismissal slowly turned into something far more dangerous, respect mixed with unease. By the time Japan understood what the P-38 Lightning truly was, it had already reshaped the air war. What Japan learned too led to the most revealing part of this story. When Japanese intelligence officers first logged sightings of the P-38, the reaction was lukewarm. Its twin-boom shape and heavy profile clashed with everything Japanese doctrine valued. Fighters were expected to be light, agile, and optimized for turning combat. The Lightning looked oversized, complex, and fuel-heavy, exactly the kind of aircraft planners believed would fail in a close fight. Early assessments dismissed it as a long-range escort rather than a true dogfighter, noting its size, weight, and wide turning radius. On paper, it seemed vulnerable to the A6M0, which had dominated Allied aircraft since 1941 through tight turns and close-range engagements. Confidence was high. Japanese pilots were experienced, and their fighter philosophy had been validated again and again in the early war. But combat does not care about paper assumptions. When P-38s began operating over the Solomons in late 1942, Japanese pilots noticed something unsettling. The Lightning did not try to turn. It attacked from above, fired from farther away than expected, and disengaged before a Zero could react. Pilots who attempted pursuit found themselves unable to close the distance or worse, stalling out as the P-38 simply climbed away. Even more disturbing was its range. Japanese pilots were accustomed to American fighters operating near their bases, but the Lightning appeared deep over contested airspace, stayed longer than expected, and still returned home. This contradicted long-held beliefs about American limitations and forced commanders to rethink their assumptions. What Japan had dismissed as an awkward brute was proving to be something else entirely, a fighter built around a philosophy they had not prepared to face. And this was only the beginning. Once Japanese pilots encountered the P-38 in sustained combat, the gap between theory and reality became impossible to ignore. Early intelligence had focused on what the Lightning could not do: tight turning, low-speed maneuvering, prolonged dogfights, but the truth was simpler and more dangerous. The P-38 was never meant to fight that kind of battle at all. Early clashes over the Solomons and New Guinea revealed a clear pattern. The P-38 arrived from altitude, often unseen until seconds before contact, using its superior speed to control engagement distance, while its nose-mounted guns delivered concentrated fire in short, lethal bursts. Japanese pilots trained for close-range deflection shots were often hit before they could even bring their weapons to bear, and attempts to pursue only made matters worse. As the Lightning could accelerate away in a dive or climb back to altitude using turbo-supercharged engines that retained power wear, Japanese engines faltered. Engagements rarely lasted long enough for traditional Japanese strengths to matter, turning air combat into brief, violent encounters followed by empty sky. More unsettling was the P-38's endurance, as it remained over combat zones far longer than expected, leading pilots to report disorienting encounters in which the same aircraft seemed to vanish and reappear minutes later from different directions, undermining situational awareness and confidence. This strain was intensified by the Lightning's durability, with Japanese pilots noting that damage which would have destroyed a Zero often failed to down a P-38, forcing them to fly perfectly against an enemy that could survive mistakes. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence no longer dismissed the Lightning as a secondary escort but identified it as a primary threat: fast, heavily armed, incapable of operating on its own terms, especially after deep penetration. Missions demonstrated a level of strategic reach Japan could not contest, making it clear that the P-38 was not exploiting a temporary weakness, but exposing a permanent one. And in doing so, it began changing not just battles, but how Japanese pilots experienced the war itself, turning combat into a mentally exhausting struggle of constant vigilance, restraint, and uncertainty. Earlier in the war, Japanese pilots entered combat with confidence shaped by experience and early success, following a familiar rhythm of spotting the enemy, maneuvering for position, committing to a turning fight, and ending it decisively. But the P-38 Lightning shattered that rhythm completely. it appeared suddenly, struck with speed and precision, and vanished before pilots could respond, leaving no sense of closure and replacing certainty with unease. Even when the lightning was not visible, its presence was felt, as pilots scanned the sky obsessively, unsure whether an unseen P-38 was already positioning above them. This constant vigilance drained focus, increased mistakes, and introduced hesitation into every decision. Commit to early and risk exposure. Wait too long and be attacked first. The Lightning's refusal to engage in prolonged fights also denied Japanese pilots morale-building victories, as even damaged P-38s often escaped, reinforcing the sense that effort was being spent while danger remained constant. This pressure intensified as experienced aviators were lost and replaced by restrained pilots who lacked the instincts needed to counter high-speed vertical attacks, making even small errors fatal. Veteran pilots later recalled that fighting the P-38 forced a defensive mindset in which aggression gave way to caution and survival replaced initiative. A profound shift for an air force built on offensive spirit and individual skill. The Lightning did not need to dominate every engagement. It only needed to impose its tempo. And over time, this psychological erosion produced real operational consequences as units became less willing to pursue. Patrols grew more conservative and opportunities were missed. Air superiority slipped not through sudden collapse, but through gradual loss of confidence. And by late 1944, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of the Lightning with bravado, but as a constant presence to be endured and respected, a reminder that air combat no longer favored instinct and agility alone, but discipline, endurance, and control, signaling that once an aircraft begins shaping how its enemy thinks, the balance of war has already begun to shift. The Lightning exploited Japan's assumptions mercilessly, stretching engagements across time and distance and forcing Japanese fighters to operate on terms they could not sustain. Even when pilots successfully avoided boom-on zoom attacks, the fight still favored the P-38, which could disengage at will while Japanese fighters could not. Pursuit risked fuel exhaustion, while breaking off surrendered airspace, and either choice eroded operational control. Over time, this dynamic pushed Japanese air units into a reactive posture, responding to American actions instead of shaping the battle. Attempts to adapt tactically ran into human limits. As veteran pilots who could anticipate P-38 attack patterns were increasingly replaced by less experienced aviators by 1944, trained under reduced flight hours and with little combat seasoning, facing an aircraft that demanded split-second judgment and strict discipline magnified every weakness. And the Lightning did not need to dominate every fight, it only needed to force mistakes. Coordination problems compounded the threat. As Japanese formations depended on close visual contact and mutual support, which the Lightning's speed shattered by slashing through formations before counterattacks could be organized, leaving isolated pilots vulnerable and often watching wingmen fall without ever gaining a clean firing solution. Japanese planners gradually recognized that countering the P-38 required systemic change: new aircraft, new engines, expanded training pipelines, and revised doctrine, but none of this could be delivered at the pace the war demanded. Incremental adjustments were no match for an opponent fighting a fundamentally different air war. The Lightning did not defeat Japan through brute force alone. It exposed the reality that Japan's air power model was no longer viable in a long, industrial, range-dominated conflict. By the final stages of the Pacific War, Japanese assessments had stripped away early bias and denial. And the P-38 was no longer viewed as a single aircraft to counter, but as a symbol of broader strategic failure, representing a shift away from romanticized dogfighting toward a form of warfare where speed, endurance, pilot protection, and coordinated systems outweighed maneuverability, leaving Japanese intelligence to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that even when their pilots fought well, the odds were no longer equal. As the Lightning could absorb damage that would have destroyed a Zero, the P-38 could disengage. When outnumbered and appear far beyond expected battle zones, advantages that were not merely technical but psychological, fundamentally shifting the balance of air combat. Veteran Japanese pilots later recalled that the Lightning's greatest danger was uncertainty. You never knew when it would appear, and you could no longer rely on forcing a decisive engagement. Survival increasingly depended on restraint rather than aggression. A direct contradiction of the offensive mindset Japan had cultivated since the 1930s. Strategically, the P-38 accelerated attrition not only in aircraft, but in confidence and experience. As each encounter chipped away at Japan's shrinking pool of skilled aviators, as losses mounted, replacements arrived with fewer flight hours and less preparation. And while the Lightning did not cause this collapse alone, it exploited it with ruthless efficiency. By the war's end, Japan's assessment was clear. The P-38 was not invincible. But it embodied a form of air warfare Japan could not match under wartime conditions, proving that adaptability, industrial depth, and tactical discipline could outweigh individual brilliance. What began as a strange silhouette on the horizon became a benchmark against which Japan measured and found one in its own assumptions about air combat, a realization that lingered long after the engines fell silent. The P-38 did not win by outearning its enemies or dazzling them with elegance. It won by exposing the hard limits of doctrine, design, and preparation. Serving as proof that the air war had fundamentally changed, that change was irreversible,